I'm Klara Syrewicz and welcome to another episode of On Air. We'll be looking at this week's headlines, and in this edition we have two reports. One on misinformation surrounding floods in Central Europe, and the second on a different kind of wave sweeping the continent, namely the rise of hard-right parties. But first, let's look at current events in the Middle East. Okay, let's not. Frankly, to say the situation is changing dynamically would be a euphemism, and there will be another grim headline by the time I finish talking. It's Saturday evening. Maybe we could take our minds off heavy subjects for a moment and talk about parties. We begin with this week's birthday bash. You know, the one where, everyone was there. Okay, it's a bit of a tamer affair, but when I say everyone was there, I mean everyone except Mr. Vladimir Putin, because it seemed that most Russia-supporting politicians from Central Europe attended this party held for the retired president of the Czech Republic, Miloš Zeman. His guests included the Hungarian Prime Minister, the Slovakian Prime Minister and the President, the Serbian President, and much to the consternation of the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Poland's President Andrzej Duda. To add insult to injury, the birthday boy didn't even know who he was.
Andrzej Duda? I don't where is he? It is
The atmosphere was a bit stiff, don't you think? I'm sure it could have been livelier if only Miloš Zeman had invited another top Fidesz politician and former member of the European Parliament, József Szájer. Now this man knows how to party. Remember lockdown, those days spent homeschooling your kids and worrying about your aging parents? Well, Szájer doesn't. Picture this, it's November 2020 in Brussels. You've just spent the day drafting another anti-LGBTQ law for the Fidesz party and you need to blow off some steam. So you attend a 25-man orgy above a gay bar, you pop some ecstasy, and when neighbors complain about the noise, you try to escape down a drain pipe with a backpack full of drugs. Perhaps yet another political career derailed by an inability to resist blowing out one too many candles. If you say orgy, I say Milan Airport. Former Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi just got an airport named after him, and unsurprisingly, there's been a big backlash this week from the City Council against the grotesque idea and some suggestions that the airport should simply be called Bunga Bunga. That was the name given to Berlusconi's infamous sex parties attended by various politicians who were photographed running around naked in his garden. And in this list of joyful reminiscence, let's not forget the 2018 wedding of Austria's former hard-right foreign minister Karin Kneißl, who seemed more enamored with her guest of honor than her own husband. Just look how nicely and deeply she curtsied. With the FPÖ getting first place in this week's election in Austria, I wonder if someone has invited Mr. Putin for a victory celebration. We stick to the lighter stuff this evening and move on to another fun subject, and that's travel. Travel and corruption. It was impossible to miss this week's story of Eric Adams' indictment. The mayor of New York stands accused of accepting more than $100,000 in illegal gifts, including expensive airline fares and stays in hotels, in exchange for quite blatant political favors benefiting Turkey. As the indictment reveals, Mr. Adams developed an obsessive thirst for luxury travel and used his Turkish connections frantically. But soon came payback time. When Mr. Adams was elected mayor, the general manager of Turkish Airlines in New York demanded a spot on his transition committee. "It would suit me well to be lead or senior advisor," he texted. And then he added, dangling the threat of a relegation to economy class at the very back of the plane near the toilet. "Lead, please, otherwise seat number 52 is empty." Most countries have their great travelers. Marco Polo, Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, James Cook, some unnamed Vikings, and Poland has former European Parliament member Ryszard Czarnecki. According to his parliamentary expense report, Czarnecki circled the globe over 5 times as he went from the small provincial town of Jasło to Brussels. It's also interesting to learn how he allegedly did that. Czarnecki's routine included a heavy-duty lorry, 3 types of rare Chinese single-track motorbikes used in wintertime, cars that weren't his and their owners knew nothing about the scheme, even one that had been scrapped 11 years earlier. But my personal favorite was a car made in 2015 that he allegedly drove in 2010. So he even managed time travel. The European Parliament is a well of surprises when it comes to eccentric travellers. Back in 2021, 5 French MEPs from the far-right Rassemblement National were invited on all expenses-paid junkets so they could pose as official observers of elections held in Russia-occupied Crimea and Kazakhstan. They later claimed, while brandishing their European Parliament credentials, that the votes were free and fair, obviously. Currently, several top Rassemblement National MEPs, including their leader Jordan Bardella, are being tried before the French criminal court for creating false employment records. They have apparently appropriated a staggering 6.8 million euros of public funds. So I have this message for Ryszard Czarnecki. Next time you attempt to rip off European taxpayers, you really need to try harder. It's quite sad to think that regular, hard-working lawmakers don't get this kind of attention. The same can be said about dozens of people providing reliable and useful information during the recent floods in Europe. As some Polish examples show, unfortunately, it's the trolls and cynical politicians sowing disinformation who win in the attention-grabbing contest. Let's see how it's done in our report.
Last month's flood in Poland has caused substantial damages to homes, infrastructure and agricultural land in the southwest of the country. But the situation is less dire than it could have been, given that Poland has taken precautionary measures after the devastating 1997 flood of the millennium. Despite this year's downpour being more intense and bigger in volume, the destruction is significantly smaller. Early estimates place the damage at around €1 billion across 3 provinces, paling in comparison to the equivalent of €80 billion in damages 30 years ago. About 57,000 people are affected, while in 1997 over 200,000 residents were directly impacted by the floodwaters. While Prime Minister Donald Tusk confirmed 9 fatalities, opposition politicians suggest the actual figure could be over 400. Several MPs cited this number, which was originally mentioned on a podcast. Its author, Katarzyna Tarnowa-Gwóźdź, was charged with treason and espionage after it was revealed that she had ties to pro-Kremlin groups. More fake news spread on social media, claiming the death toll had reached hundreds or even thousands. This post, asking for aid for a school in Kłodzko, was manipulated to instead claim Ukrainian refugees had prevented a Polish woman and her child from getting help.
During the first days of the flood crisis, online disinformation from the Belarusian and Russian services increased by 300%. Internet accounts previously used in the beginning of the war in Ukraine have been reactivated.
The Cyberspace Defense Forces confirmed this to be part of a Russian information warfare strategy.
Vladimir Putin is cheering. His carefully curated team of supporters and some useful idiots among far-right parties in Europe is growing, along with their influence on mainstream politics. Where are those parties making their biggest strides, and how will this affect the continent's political landscape? More on that in our next feature.
Austria's far-right Freedom Party has just secured victory in the 2024 general election, achieving a record result of nearly 30%. Formed in April 1956, the party's roots run all the way back to the Greater German People's Party, which pursued Austria's unification with the Third Reich. The Freedom Party's first leader, Anton Reintaler, a former Nazi Minister of Agriculture, and his successor, Friedrich Peter, were both SS officers. Its message would fluctuate throughout the years, but took a radical turn in 2006 when it adopted an anti-immigration, anti-Islam, and Eurosceptic narrative. Austria's neighbor has witnessed the meteoric rise of the far-right alternative for Germany, known as AfD, and formed in 2013. Today, around 1 in 5 national respondents have a favorable view of the AfD. Emerging victorious in Thuringia with about 33% support in early September, the party made history by becoming the first far-right group to win a state election since 1945. In neighboring Saxony, the AfD came in close second with almost 31% and nearly matched the result in a later election in Brandenburg.
We have primarily won with young people, not just in this election in Brandenburg, but in all elections.
Moving to France, where the dynastic National Rally Party's leader Marine Le Pen garnered close to 42% support in the presidential race of 2022. In 2024, the party itself secured 32% of votes in France's European Parliament elections. The frontman personality of the party's former leader, Jean-Marie Le Pen, often obscured the murky past of its other founding member, former SS officer Pierre Bousquet. Although Marine Le Pen forced her father to retire from politics in 2015 and toned down the party's most radical narratives, the National Rally continues to oppose immigration and the visibility of Islam in France while maintaining a friendly stance toward Russia. The European Parliament has also been swept in the rise of right-wing parties. As of July, out of its 720 seats, 315 are held by MEPs hailing from right-of-centre groups such as the European People's Party, European Conservatives and Reformists Party, and Patriots for Europe. Together with other far-right parties, AfD founded the Europe of Sovereign Nations Party in the European Parliament in August 2024. Currently, several European Union countries have right-wing parties in positions of power or in ruling coalitions. Among them are Hungary, Slovakia, Italy, the Netherlands, Sweden and Finland.
And welcome back. We have John Todd with us. Hello, John. Hello. Great to see you. Just as a reminder, when Austria's Jörg Haider was entering the Austrian government in 1999, in the EU, there were talks of excluding the country from the bloc, and also diplomatic sanctions were imposed. Another example is when Jean-Marie Le Pen entered the second round of elections in France in 2002, when there were street protests, and his opponent, Jacques Chirac, got a staggering 80-something% of votes in the election because of this. And now the FPÖ has just won the election in Austria, and it's business as usual. Nobody seems to be concerned.
Yeah, those days seem a long, long way away. I mean, the far right is on the rise across Europe. As we saw a moment ago, both in Parliament, but also, I'm going to say, on the streets as well. There was an example this week that the BBC cited of a neo-Nazi from Finland who helped fan the flames of the riots that spread across Britain this year. He was posting online to thousands of Telegram supporters, including providing a manual on arson, so they provided instructions on how to set fires. But it's not just activists like those that are across the continent that are on the rise. It's also on the political front as well. But I would say some, like the Freedom Party of Austria and the National Rally in France, may have dropped some of their most extremist positions and are generally swapping fire and fury for a more professional flair.
Yes, that's the thing, because Le Monde recently compared the program of Marine Le Pen and her father, and it turns out that they are practically identical, except the rhetoric and the way that they are dressed is a bit different. What interests me is how those parties may collaborate in the future, because that's another thing that's quite new. They are far more likely to join forces on many issues, despite the fact that there's been some squabbles within the European Parliament. They're not that effective there, but nonetheless, do you think that they will have a growing influence on European politics?
Well, at the European level, there's an intrinsic problem that they face. They're nationalist parties, so they want to do down their neighbours who they might otherwise be wanting to cooperate on. I mean, we've seen manoeuvring on a national level. We've seen manoeuvring to try and keep these parties out of power. So that's what happened over in France over the summer. Taking a broader look, these right-wing parties have got strong links with Moscow, and they favour a pro-Russian approach, such as a common anti-LGBTQ approach. approaches on energy policy and favouring things like the Russian Sputnik COVID jab. Parties like the National Rally's predecessor, the National Front, was in hock to Russia when they were going down the pans. And I'd say the rise in these parties can be partly traced to the support and cooperation provided by Russia.
But also the issue that really carried those parties to the top ticket in most of these elections is, of course, migration. And you can see that this has an influence on mainstream politics. But many analysts point out that mainstream parties haven't developed a very clear narrative of how they will address these concerns. And because of that, many voters might prefer the so-called real deal as opposed to the copy.
We're seeing this calls for greater controls on migration, both at the European level and at national levels. And I think we have to remember that it's nearly a decade on since the 2015 European migration crisis. I mean, I understand in Austria one of the issues was the fact that the difficulty in integrating people at a faster rate than the one that people arrive in the country. Whereas previously, a number of years ago, we were talking about green businesses, green tech, as a way forward, and the war in Ukraine. Now migration has risen to the top of the agenda. In Germany, Chancellor Olaf Scholz fighting off attacks from the AfD. He's taken the position that they're cracking down, introducing border checks on his borders in order to be seen to be doing something.
One of the champions of these tougher policies as well is Giorgia Meloni. She is heading the country's most right-wing government since World War II. And yet, in the European Council at least, she has proven not as obstructive and difficult as many people thought she would be. So is her brand of populism the future of mainstream politics?
I think we're moving in that direction. She's an interesting case. She has quite a lot of, I'd say she's got a lot of voter appeal, so appeals to women. She was, I like the idea that she actually ditched her husband when he was caught recording off camera. He's a TV journalist, and he said was making sexist remarks to a guest. She's a mother, so I think she appeals to a number of things. If you compare her to Silvio Berlusconi, one of her predecessors, I'd say she's got a very different approach and feel. Now, supporters of Berlusconi and supporters of Meloni may share a lot of similarities. I'd say it's the same in France as well, actually, where Marine Le Pen has put forward Jordan Bardella, who is also a youthful, fresh face to a party. And I'd say they both prettify what otherwise might be said to be sort of a ugly politics, extreme language and extreme opinions that lie on the fringes of their party.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. And thank you for being here. In the next episode, we'll be looking at nuclear doctrine and also at LGBTQ rights in the world. See you soon.